So you've done all of your research about the KKK, and you've been finding evidence to answer those three core questions. You're going to turn that into a report, answering each question and using evidence from each of the sources. So I wanted to talk to you about how to actually embed quotes in a way that you're not just kind of like dropping them in. So we're talking about quotes. A quote is a group of words that you took from somebody else's text. So it was written by somebody other than you. And they are a type of evidence. So if we're like compiling a report, they should help you prove something. So anytime you're borrowing somebody else's writing, it should be for a purpose. So it should be saying something in a way that you couldn't say it, or that helps you pull in information that improves your argument. So why would I use a quote? It helps you support your ideas. It helps improve your writing, because like if you're just like an eighth grader saying, here's what I think the KKK is, that doesn't have as much pull, no offense, as, pulling from an expert or pulling from a primary source as an example. It helps you kind of make your case. So you provide evidence to support your claims. It's helps you prove how you know something. So instead of you just asserting that something is true, it gives you like, well, how do you know that? Here's the evidence. And by properly using quotations, it helps you avoid plagiarism accusations. So if you cite something as borrowed, that's okay. It's not okay to just copy paste and claim that you wrote something that you didn't, but it's good to use expert evidence as long as you properly cite it. So some do's and don'ts. You should include quotes in your body paragraph. So if we're writing, let's say like a traditional 5-paragraph essay, you have your intro, your 3 bodies, and a conclusion. You should only include quotes in the middle. So in that body part. And then anytime you're providing like examples or evidence, a quote is a really good thing to use there. You should not include quotes in your intro or your conclusion. Your thesis statement is like you saying, here's what I'm going to argue in this paper. That should not have a quote in it, because that should be wholly you. And then the topic sentences, which would be the first sentence of your body paragraphs, that should be like when you introduce your point, that should be you talking. So you wouldn't want to use a quote. You wouldn't want to start a paragraph with a quote. Couple quoting rules. Never let a quotation stand alone. Never begin a sentence with a quote. So you should always like introduce it with where it came from, so that I'm not like reading along in your paper and then all of a sudden it's somebody else talking. You should always like introduce wherever it's coming from. And you should always explain your quote after you properly cite it. We'll talk about that too. So we've been talking about races throughout the entire, what's that been, like 2 months since January? We're going to add an extra letter. So last year we called this raíces, to bring in your Spanish. So it kind of integrates itself directly in. So introduce, cite, and explain. We already cite, we already explain. So now we're going to restate, answer, introduce our quotation, cite our quotation, explain it, and summarize. So we're putting in an extra letter. So how we introduce, this is the newest part. So as you're introducing a quote, here's kind of like a selection of things that you can include. You wouldn't have to use all of these every time. That would be a little bit crazy. But these are things that you could include. So you could cite the author. You could say, you can introduce it with the title of the text. So like in the Diary of Anne Frank, Anne says, you could mention the format or the genre. So like you could say in the podcast, the problem we all live with, Mariah says, blah, blah, blah. You could also give a brief summary of the context. So you could say like in an essay about Brown versus Board of Education, the author mentions Thurgood Marshall. She says, or he says, and then you can continue from there. So you can like summarize a little bit what it's about. You should not include the page number in the introduction. So sometimes kids will try to say like on page 26, it says, that's not really useful. It doesn't tell me anything about the text at all. You can put that in an in-text citation and it adds like just as much information. So stick to things that are meaningful, that kind of give context to your quote instead of just the page number. There are 4 ways to introduce quotations, and I'll show you each one. So you can do with a complete sentence and a colon. It's kind of a fancy way to do it. With an explanatory phrase and a comma, that's probably the way, that most of you do this. Martin Luther King says, comma, blah, blah, blah. You can include short quotes within the sentence. You can kind of like stick them in your own writing, or you can paraphrase the quote, which is when you completely take somebody else's words, rephrase them, keep the same idea, but it's in your own wording instead. So we're going to use Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. And as we think about those different ways to introduce, I told you could do the author, the title, the format, or a brief summary of the context. So the author was delivered by Martin Luther King on August 28th, 1963. Where it was delivered was Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. And the context of it, like what is it about? It's about his dream of racial equality. So now I'm going to kind of mix and match those pieces into introductions. So here's the quote that we're going to work with. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. It's an incredibly famous quote from that speech. Okay, so the first way you can do this is you can use a colon before citing the quote. So you would use a complete sentence and then a colon. So in his I Have a Dream speech, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. talked about his hope for equality. Whole sentence, colon. Then here's my quote. So that's a complete sentence. In his I Have a Dream speech, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is our subject. Talked is our verb about his hope for equality, colon. Then you just put your quote there. Colons are something that you probably aren't as familiar with. You're probably more familiar with using a semicolon. Just be careful that you hit shift and then the colon button. So you shouldn't have like a comma down here. It should be 2 dots, like the eyes of a wide open smiley face. The second way you can do this is the one that I said is probably the most familiar to you, and this time you use a comma. So in his 1963 speech, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, and then when you explain what it is that he said, you put a comma, and there it is. It's almost like dialogue. So you can see that this time I used like the format and the date and the person. So you're kind of mix and matching things. The last time I used the title of the speech and the author and the context. So I kind of pulled different things that time. Didn't use the date that time. So here's your explanatory phrase. In his 1963 speech, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, and I punctuate it this time with a comma. This one, I remember kids last year having trouble trying to figure out how to do this, but you can include only short quotes within your own sentence. You want to stick to just like a few words that the author used better than you could. You put the original words in quotes, and sorry about that. And punctuate the sentence as you normally would. So I'll show you what that looks like. Speaking at the Lincoln Memorial, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. dreamed of a day when his children would only be judged by the, quote, content of their character. So I'm only using a piece of it, and I'm kind of paraphrasing the rest. So what I quoted from him shows up in quotes here. And then the rest of it is just my own writing, and I punctuate it the way I typically would. The last way is paraphrasing. So you can write the quote in your own words and make sure that you aren't changing the meaning. So don't paraphrase it so much that you've completely changed what the original intent of the quote was. So in his 1963 I Have a Dream speech, Martin Luther King said, so you can see that like I'm still introducing it like it's a quote, but then I'm paraphrasing the rest of it. So he said that he dreamed of a day when people would look at his kids and see who they were as people instead of their skin color. So instead of they would be judged by the content of their character, not by the color of their skin, I worded to they look at their kids and see who they are as people instead of their skin color. So like the same idea, but I'm using my own words instead. All right. After you have introduced a quote, then you cite it. Citing is literally just copying the quote word for word. So make sure that you include enough of it to make sense. Sometimes kids will start especially if they don't fully understand the quote, they'll start like in the middle of the sentence, and it's not, you haven't actually included like all the pieces that contribute to the meaning of the quote. This is the only time that copying in school is okay, is when you're citing a quote. So, enjoy it when you can do it. That's it for cite. And then after that, you explain it. A lot of kids really struggle with the E part of races. So just a few different ways that you could explain a quote, different ideas. So you can connect the quote to the main idea of your paragraph or paper. So if you're trying to argue that who the KKK is, and you say that they're primarily white men, and you pull a quote that is the description of who can be a member from the manual, for example, and you list that out, and then you say these are the only people who would be allowed to be a part of the KKK. So you connect it back to who they are. Why is it important and relevant? So if you pulled, think of another good one. Like the invisible, the torch on the Invisible Empire badge. So why is the torch important or relevant? Well, it's used as a threat. So that's how they accomplish their goals, by threatening people. And then I think in some of the other sources, it mentions them burning houses and things. So you could talk about how the torch is an important symbol of danger and of threats. How one answers the question. So that's going to be fairly easy for you guys for this, because you're literally operating with questions. So how do they accomplish their goals? If they are, covering their faces, then they are accomplishing their goals by being anonymous. And that's how they were able to get away with it. Interpret the quote in your own words. So for that, it's you reword, especially a quote that's really difficult to understand. Afterwards, you can say what this quote means is, and you kind of break it down into words that make sense for you, how you interpret it, and then pull out specific words and explain what they mean. I love doing this. So if a quote specifically says the invisible empire, so I might say the word invisible means that they can't be seen. So they are able to operate in a way that nobody knows who they are. The word empire brings up these ideas of taking over and having a lot of power over a big space. So their goal was to be anonymous, but also control really all of America. So I pull out specific words and I explain what those words mean in the context of whatever it is that I'm trying to argue. Here are some sentence starters that would help you explain a quote. So this shows that. This highlights the difference between, in other words, the author uses the word blank, invisible, which means whatever. So as you're starting your explanation part, these would be good ways to do that. And then when you put it all together, here's what it looks like. So if my topic sentence is the average teen is able to become an overnight star thanks to the social media app TikTok, which, by the way, when I wrote this last year, when I put this together last year, I didn't know anything about TikTok. I didn't know what it was. Still don't really understand it. But now it's huge, So according to Kaya Yuriev, unlike many other popular apps, TikTok is, so I have my author, a context, and then here I'm introducing it with just a phrase. So it is, quote, designed for posts to go viral more organically than on any other media platform, with new trends, hashtags, and challenges capable of receiving billions of views in a matter of hours, end quote. TikTok allows a poster's content to be seen more quickly than other similar social media outlets. This, combined with recognizable hashtags, can create a star out of an ordinary kid. So here I have introduced my evidence with the author. I've cited my evidence here, and I've explained it. So ICE. Working off of a question similar to what you guys are going to be doing. So if I were the Department of Homeland Security, and I'm writing about ISIS and the same questions. How does ISIS accomplish its goals? So I'm going to restate the prompt. In order to accomplish its goal of implementing Sharia law in the Middle East, ISIS uses social media extensively. So that's my answer. I'm going to introduce a quote. Senator Carper said at a 2016 Senate hearing that ISIS, I'm citing here, ISIS uses social networks to, quote, do the group's bidding from thousands of miles away. That's my site and my source number. So I'm going to put source number 1. They also fund their efforts in illegal ways. So another answer. Ashley Fance, a CNN reporter, says, quote, ISIS's revenue comes from oil production and smuggling, taxes, ransoms from kidnappings, selling stolen artifacts, extortion, and controlling crops. Source number. So if you are writing that third question, how does the KKK accomplish its goals? This is a perfect model of what that could look like. So like you would restate the prompt, you would answer it with maybe 1 or 2 different answers, and then you're going to introduce your sources and quote it. So that's a perfect example of what this will look like.